Hello, welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast where you break and destroy false idols and icons of the digital age in search for more authentic esoteric spirituality. And this is your host, Georgina Rose, also known as Dot Darling. In this episode, I will be releasing another solo podcast. I do these very regularly, where essentially I sit down alone and discuss esoteric topics from my perennialist and polytheist perspective. This podcast addresses everything on the fringes of esoterica, so that means we discuss hard occultism, things related to occultism, and how occultism can help us understand society and culture. There's a very broad focus with this podcast. And in this episode, I actually am going to be talking about hard metaphysics, which I don't always do on this podcast. I also have a YouTube channel for those who are unfamiliar with me. And often on my YouTube channel, I pretty much exclusively talk about occultism proper and not kind of the things adjacent to it. But in this episode, I really think those things overlap a lot. And I have so much to say in this podcast that I don't think it fits a YouTube video structure. Um, but before I get into the actual topic, I would like to mention that I am hosting a group trip to Greece with Trip, where if you sign up now, you'll get a major discount and you can go with my amazing subscribers and community to see Greece and see the beautiful esoteric world and the ancient world up close and in real life. Now, I do have one other thing to say before I start talking, which is very rare for me. I'm not someone who typically gives any sort of heads up about an episode before I start talking. It's not my typical nature, but I think with this episode, this is necessary. This is going to be a very heavy, hard, dark, somewhat sad episode. It's not like just misery time. Like this is about solving some of the hardest problems we deal with as humans using mysticism. But due to the nature of a lot of what I'm going to discuss here, if you would rather listen to something a bit more positive, I really recommend checking out the rest of my catalog. But I think at the same time, even though this episode is hard and it might bring up thoughts about very difficult things, I think it is something that will really benefit people. And it's something I've been sitting on for a very long time. So, what I'm actually going to talk about is essentially the idea of how mysticism can help us with some of the darkest things we experience and what are the metaphysical explanations for a lot of these parts of our lives that we struggle to understand and how to work through them. The general things that I'm going to be discussing will be shadow work, which is a very, very common idea. I'm going to explain it in great depth. Um, Basically, using mysticism to get you beyond trauma. Trauma is something that is going to come up a lot in this episode. Healing yourself from pain, understanding the metaphysical meaning of suffering. I am also going to talk about the problem of evil, a metaphysical quandary that people have been discussing for a very long time. The process of crossing the abyss in a ritualistic focus, and the dark night of the soul. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, when I talk about addressing the darkest parts of the human condition using mysticism and using mysticism to heal us from our greatest pains in life, I think we need to begin just with the first point that I always think about when these subjects come up. Mysticism is something we seek out to grow as people and to grow closer to the divine. And I don't think we seek this stuff out for no reason. I do not believe a single action any human makes ever is unmotivated. We may not consciously understand why we are doing something, but our subconscious does. I find often when people do things in life that they don't understand why they're doing it, or it feels impulsive, or it feels strange, or they feel this weird nagging pain about it, there's a reason why. And if you look deep enough within yourself, that reason becomes incredibly apparent. And when people seek out mysticism, they seek out religion, they seek out these things, especially if they are someone who is not previously the most religious or previously the most spiritual, they typically are doing that from some place of pain. This has been very consistent. Now, this does not apply to everyone, but I have known a lot of people who have gotten into religiosity and spirituality with a desire to change their life, right? A desire for something to be different, right? Because when we think about the drive towards God, I think the drive towards God or the gods, however you want to put that, is built on a foundation of yearning. And the word yearning is very interesting to me because yearning is a form of desire, a desire that is not fully complete, right? It's seeking unity with something that you don't have full unity with and feeling some sort of anguish or craving or desire to be there. And with the divine, we are not fully 100% dissolved into the divine, right? And so we are yearning for that dissolution. We are yearning for that connection. And that often comes from a place of change. I noticed that there was a big rise of interest in these subjects when there was a lot of political and social upheaval. Specifically, back during the coronavirus thing, there were a lot of people who were very unhappy during that period of time, and they turned towards spirituality. And a lot of people I know, including myself, got interested in this stuff when they were in a rough point in their life. I have never given the specifics of what was going on in my life at the time, but I have mentioned that my foray into taking the occult seriously. Now, I was always a spiritual person. I always was a bit of a troublemaker. I've talked about stories how in church when I was a kid, I would like ask annoying questions and I would drive everyone crazy because I believe there was something religiously true, but there were things about the Bible and things about the services that I just didn't agree with or didn't square with me. And so I would ask 8 million thousand questions to everyone. Um, but when I actually started seriously considering these ideas and becoming an actual practitioner, it did begin at a point in my life where I was very dissatisfied and disillusioned, and I wanted change, right? It was a desire for something to be different. And for me, when I got into occultism after that period in my life got so much better. I developed a stronger sense of resilience. And it has continuously been one of the most important things in my life since. It really did change my life for the better. And when I talk, because I've talked to probably hundreds of people who have gotten into mysticism and the occult, and very often I hear stories like that, right? I hear people who have come to religion after grief, right? Say their husband or wife has died and they've wanted to understand more about the universe. Or they were someone like me who just wasn't having the best time in life and wanted to take action to change it. Or there's someone who sees problems in the world around them and wants a more virtuous world. And so they seek out religion as some sort of way to make sense of that. Or they're just someone who is deeply curious, right? And they feel dissatisfied with not having the answers for everything in this world. And so they seek out religion to sort of fill in those blanks and answer those questions, right? There's a lot of different reasons and motivations for it. And all of those often come from a place of wanting change. And even if you are not coming from this from that place, because there are a lot of people, and I'm sure some people listening who do not relate to that, right? They've gotten into this stuff out of just genuinely finding it cool or thinking it's neat, or maybe they met someone who was a really intense practitioner and they were like, oh shit, your astrology stuff seems to be working, I'm going to get into this now, right? There are a lot of other reasons why people get into this stuff, and some people it is genuinely like they liked the aesthetics of occultism, or they liked a movie that had occultism in it and then they wanted to understand it and they were like, oh wait, there's something here for that. But in general, I do find most people who get into this stuff have something they want to change, something they want to grow. And if they can't pin it to some specific reason, right, there still is a desire for growth in every mystic I've ever known. Because what mysticism is it's a chase, right? It's a chase towards gnosis, right? When we say achieve gnosis, it's something we don't have, right? We might have a little bit of gnosis, but I firmly believe that no one who is a living human being, right, who hasn't died and united with the gods, still is growing, still is evolving, still is healing. Even people who have had really beautiful, happy lives with not a lot of problems, there are still things that they need to heal from. And often, even if you are someone who has had a perfect life on paper, there still is a desire for something more, right? Humans, since the beginning of time, since before we had civilization, have looked up at the stars and wanted more, wanted to understand, wanted to make sense of things. And that thirst for knowledge, that thirst for growth, underscores everything. And for that reason, I think every single person interested in these topics will be dealing with these type of mystic growths and practices and moments at some point in their journey. For some people, it will be much more extreme, right? And for some people, like working through severe trauma is going to inherently be part of their spiritual journey, whereas for others, that may be less of the case. But no matter what, we all are going to be experiencing this, because when we talk about the shadow, because a lot of these things come from the shadow, we are looking at an idea about parts of the soul. So basically, pretty much every religion, every culture has an idea that within our soul, basically, the first thing is okay, every human has a soul. There is something to us that is beyond our body and mind. There is an inherent consciousness to humanity. And as science has gotten better, and science, I feel like, is often playing catch up to mysticism. I think in general, science is an attempt to make sense of things that, we don't understand yet, right? And so ideas like consciousness, ideas like souls are finally starting to enter psychology and science in a more serious way. There's always been that. Like, the history of science and the history of religion are much more intertwined than people think. But even like the most secular materialist view of how humans operate has a vague sense of this type of idea, even if they say it's not understood, right? The scientific consensus is consciousness does appear to exist, but it's not quite understood why or what it means. Now, once we step out of the realm of science and materialism and into the realm of religion and esotericism, we see a lot of theories of the soul. And in general, there is a kind of like, if we look at all the religions in the world, there's generally a sort of consensus agreement that there are parts of the self, parts of the soul. Now, you can map this in a bunch of different ways. I think a really interesting way is to map the astrological natal chart of someone. Because if you look at someone's natal chart, you see that someone has different signs for their Saturn, their moon, their rising, their descendant, right? And that all implies sort of parts of the self that we are experiencing. In psychology, it is often called the id, the ego, and the superego, or the conscious and the subconscious. And when we look at Western esotericism, I think it is, you know, a bit wrong to not bring up Carl Jung, who was technically a psychological writer, but he was also a Gnostic, he was also an occultist, and his writing is so deeply informed by occultism that it is going to influence us. And he had this idea that every person had a shadow self. Now, when you hear that, I think people think it means there's like a dark, evil version of the self, and that's not what the shadow is. The shadow is the repressed self, right? Like if we see our life as like an iceberg chart, right? The shadow is what is underneath the water, right? Even going all the way down to the deepest part of that iceberg, that part that we don't fully grasp. And an idea similar to this is a cross cultural agreement, right? There is a shadow, there is a subconscious self, there is a repressed self, there is part of us that we don't see and that is heavily influencing our actions, right? Sometimes to the point where the shadow is actually controlling us, which is a huge, huge problem. And I'll get into that in a bit. But your shadow is real, and your shadow is there, and your shadow is guiding you whether you like it or not. Now, a lot of people then get this idea, okay, well, I need to kill my shadow self and wholly be a conscious self, right? Exist solely in the superego. Now, this is not possible because the shadow is an inherent part of the soul, right? The shadow is there whether you like the shadow or not. So, how do we actually deal with our shadow? Well, first, we need to understand it. An axiom in Hermetic mysticism that I'm sure you have all heard 8 million times is know thyself. But it is incredibly important. Knowing thyself is one of those like really simple ideas that's actually really complicated when you try to do it because most people don't know anything about themselves, right? There are some people who this is far more extreme for than others, but in general, a lot of people don't get themselves because while like therapy is really popular in our current culture, and I think that's out of a desire for people to know themselves, people still don't think about it, right? Even some people who go to therapy and seek out like psychological treatment for their problems, they just want affirmation, right? Not all of them, some of them really are doing the work, but a lot of people literally just want someone to pat them on the back and say, oh, you're doing nothing wrong. And of course, that is not all therapy. I have no problems with therapy, but there's a lot of people who are seeking that out, right? They think they're seeking out shadow work and they're actually just seeking out affirmation. And to do actual shadow work, you need to stop affirming yourself in that way, but you also need to be forgiving towards yourself, right? You need to understand that in every moment we are reborn, we are starting a new life. Every 7 years, every single cell in our body is a different cell, right? We are always changing, we are always in flux. And I think that bit of compassion is really important to remember when you go through shadow work because I have seen a lot of people do shadow work who hold hatred towards themselves for whatever reason. Maybe they've done something wrong in the past that they regret, or maybe there are traits about them that they find kind of disturbing, right? You need to have a bit of compassion with yourself while at the same time not seeking out validation of these things, right? You need to know what your problems are and then work through those problems, right? Knowing yourself is also a continuous process. There is no moment where you'll be like, well, I know myself right now, I know myself forever, I'm done. No, you will always be seeking out knowing yourself. I believe, and this is my little theory that I've created. Anyone can steal this or use this. I haven't copyrighted it, but basically, I think good mystic practice exists in three branches: praxis, excuse me, no, I misspoke. So, study, practice or praxis, and contemplation. And that third wing, that contemplation wing, the one that we don't talk about as much, is a big part of shadow work. But I also want to say shadow work does not wholly exist within the frame of contemplation. I think shadow work begins with contemplation. I think that is step number one. But one thing I find is when shadow work is discussed online, it is often solely put in the category of contemplation. And then you're not actually doing things to work through it, because there are actual mystic techniques that can break you out of shadow work, specifically through certain ritualistic processes that I'm going to talk about can get you out of that. But before I talk about the actual processes to get through your shadow, I want to talk about the general best way to view shadow work, and that is with an idea called integration. So, in our base state, right, a non spiritually evolved person is very compartmentalized. Basically, we have ourselves put into all these little boxes, right? We're broken down into all these parts, and we don't think about how those parts go together. We have our work self, our love self, our blah, da, 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 right? We're in all these boxes, and we put the things that are our shadow self in its own box. Right? I will call it like the toxic box or the bad box or whatever we want to call it. Now, as long as we are doing that, we will not control our shadow, right? If you are experiencing strong emotions, what's the worst thing in the world you can do? Push them down. In fact, I actually read an interesting psychological theory the other day that the cause of post traumatic stress disorder is someone who does not process their emotions in the moment, and they avoid them so long that they develop a whole neurosis around whatever they've experienced, right? It's all about that avoidance. That avoidance is a huge, huge problem. And so, as long as you are avoiding your feelings, you are not integrating your shadow. As long as you are seeking out surrogate activities or drugging away your feelings or whatever, right? You're not doing the work. So, first you need to take that shadow and understand your goal is to not get rid of it or pretend it doesn't exist or let it be inactive, but instead integrate it and bring it into the whole. The goal in mysticism is to break down boundaries, break down compartments, right? And create something new. The idea of being like a bride to a god or married to a god, why is that metaphor often used? That is used because it is culturally understood in the West that marriage is the dissolution of two people into one flesh to create a unit. And that type of relationship is what you are trying to do when you are making mystic process either with a god or with your shadow, right? You are trying to break down those barriers and become a new thing. To be reborn, you must die. And this whole thing is a whole process. So you need to take your shadow, you need to unite your shadow with the other parts of your consciousness. And then, as weird as it sounds, you will have a lot more control over your shadow, and your shadow will no longer be guiding your actions in a dysfunctional and disordered manner. So you need to go into that shadow. Yes, you need to dive deep into it. You need to not repress it. You need to not avoid it. You need to actually face the shadow. And then when you go into the shadow, you go through a mystic journey that forges the soul. And then you bring that shadow into the rest of yourself. Having shadow traits or dark traits are actually typically beneficial in our life, right? A lot of these things have a purpose, right? They protect us, they defend us. And so if you can take all those traits about yourself and make it something you control and have integrated, you can use them in productive ways while also not avoiding your feeling. And that is how you're going to sort of get over that shadow. I also believe everyone needs to do shadow work. I do not think there is anyone who is exempt from this. There are some people who need to do shadow work like a lot more than other people, and there are some people whose shadow work is a longer process, but we all need to be doing it. I do not think there is anyone in a world that is so toxic and counter to how we are meant to be living who does not have something that they need to deal with. And even if, you somehow thrive in this dysfunctional society, right? Maybe you are the like 1% of people who function. There still are going to be things in your shadow you don't understand. There's still going to be things you are repressing that you'll need to understand to become a whole. Now, mysticism is the best way to do shadow work. Shadow work in the modern occult community is used so vaguely, there's never instructions on how to actually do it. I believe start with contemplation, start with those shadow work prompts that everyone shares, right? I think they're useful to start, but you don't finish there. You don't just like journal away your shadow. That's not how it works. You need to use mystical techniques, use invocations, use the gods, use meditations, and use things like even astral projection and whatnot to actually explore your shadow mystically to actively connect with the shadow. So then you have united with it through mystic technique. So I think that is also a big thing. And I think that's missed in the discussion. Now, I want to talk about a reality of shadow work that makes a lot of people uncomfortable and makes some people even dislike the idea. And that is the inherent reality that if you are doing shadow work in any serious capacity, you are going to be touching on the most painful things you've experienced in your life, trauma. Now, trauma is used in so many ways now, and I'm going to use trauma in a very vague sense. Trauma is anything that has happened in your life that has fucked you up, right? All of those adverse experiences, all of those pains. And when you are doing shadow work, you will almost universally see that there is some sort of trauma. And it might be things that are not like medically classified as trauma, it might be like little things that have completely reshaped you that you need to work through in order to become whole. And for a lot of people, especially people who are on the more extreme trauma side of the continuum, people who may literally have PTSD or CPTSD or something, like people have very severe trauma. People in that camp do need to exercise a lot more caution around shadow work and around these themes than the general public would. And so if you are one of those people, I think you need to do this. I don't think you should avoid it. Like I've seen some people say shadow work doesn't work for people who have, more severe trauma. And I don't agree with that. I think if anything, they need it more, but they need to go at a slower pace. And I would recommend doing shadow work with someone else, at least helping you along the way if you were in a situation like that. Um, Having a strong support network who know what you're doing shadow work in a group setting or with another practitioner who can help guide you through it could be really, really valuable if you're in that situation. But I do not think that situation like negates you out. I just think you need a lot more safeguards and a lot more breaks. I believe in daily ritual. I tell everyone to do daily ritual, but shadow work should not be part of your daily ritual. I think that is way too much for anyone's mind, and could totally risk sending you into melancholy or a state of miasma, because miasma or spiritual pollution can overlap with shadow work. Too much miasma causes serious spiritual diseases, and requires immense purification. And certain shadow work practices are miasma inducing, especially if you have things that you need to work through that relate to death, because things related to death and dying inherently carry a lot of miasma. And so if you are doing shadow work, you need to also be doing purification. I do not think there's anyone who should have a solely shadow work based practice. I think that would be destabilizing. Our practices need to be balanced. And so for however much shadow work you are doing, you need to be doing even more purification. And if you're doing shadow work related to death, even just a vague fear of death, because a lot of people who have a materialist background really fear death because they don't have a spiritual understanding of how death is just the beginning of the next step, right? Your purification needs to be on lock. You need to be banishing a lot. You need to be doing a lot of work alongside your shadow work. And I think there is one thing that I brought up a little earlier that is very important in shadow work, especially shadow work that relates to things with miasma involved, and that is compassion. So, compassion is complicated because too much compassion can be a deficit for a person. It can be a way someone is taken advantage of by the world. I mean, Crowley Infamous said, compassion is a vice of kings, right? I don't think compassion is a vice, but I think compassion needs to be controlled. But one place where you need compassion, it's often where people have the least compassion. I find people typically have more compassion for the screaming vagrant who's throwing bottles at you on the street than for yourself, right? You need to have the most compassion for yourself and for your past. Because one thing is true, you cannot change the past, but you can change the future. I also believe in fate, and trusting fate can be really, really valuable. But whether you believe in fate or not, you do need to forgive yourself. If you would forgive someone else who has done whatever it is you've done, you should forgive yourself. And so having that kindness towards yourself during this process is going to make a huge, huge difference. And if you don't, you probably need to figure out what that is. Now, one thing I also want to talk about in general is suffering. So, suffering is probably the thing that is most avoided in modern culture. I mean, so much of our culture is built around avoiding suffering at any cost. I think the most extreme example of this is that we have I mean, I live in Appalachia, right? And there is a big opioid crisis everywhere, but there's especially one here. And I know some people who work in social work and whatnot around here. And what I've noticed is there's a lot of people who are taking heavy drugs and abusing drugs to avoid their feelings, right? And avoid suffering. And by avoiding suffering, these people are suffering more because now they also have addiction to work towards. And so the pursuit of the avoidance of suffering is a mind fuck because it always creates suffering, right? Think about how many people turn to, say, being really hedonistic to avoid suffering, right? They have some big hole in their heart that they're filling with hedonistic behavior. And what does that hedonism do? It makes them feel empty, it makes them feel used, it makes them feel dirty. And so by avoiding the suffering through pleasure seeking behavior, you are, first of all, missing the pleasure in those behaviors. You're not even getting to enjoy the hedonism, and you're increasing your suffering to an even higher degree. And so, what you need to do is when there is a time in your life, when there is a thing in your life that is making you suffer, you need to allow yourself to suffer, right? And give yourself permission to feel all of those emotions related to suffering, because we are all going to experience suffering, and what you can do with suffering is really beautiful, because from suffering you can find your strength. I read an interesting quote, and I don't remember where it was from, and it says, will, or no, at the bottom of the survival instinct exists the purest form of will. If anyone knows where I heard this quote, please let me know, because I actually don't know where this quote is from, and it's been bothering me for weeks because it's one of the most interesting things I've ever heard. Because when we think about the survival instinct, the innate drive to stay alive, the innate drive to fight, to do anything to keep your body going, what is that fueled by? Will. And what is will? Will is one of the most powerful metaphysical forces out there. There are entire religions built around finding your will and using it to enact change. Because what is magic at the end of the day? Magic is using your will to enact change. And so all of magic exists within this idea of will. And one way that people find will is through the survival instinct. The most extreme form of this is people who have near death experiences or who are in extreme physical danger and discover spirituality in that moment. They discover their will, they discover their desire to live, they discover their desire to fix themselves, to have a great life. And so when we let ourselves suffer and we don't avoid it causing more suffering, or if you are someone who's been avoiding suffering for a very long time and you're suffering because of the suffering, wherever you're at in that cycle, you need to stop and let yourself feel. Let yourself suffer and let that suffering be the first step towards getting beyond suffering. Because to get beyond our suffering, we need to find our will. Where can we often find our will? In pain. Because when we are in pain, our brain is sending off signals to stop that pain. And for many, that is where they can find their will. And so when suffering inevitably hits you, it is incredibly spiritually beneficial to lean into that suffering and find meaning in that suffering. I think specifically to the malefics in astrology. So in astrology, we understand that there are benefics, or planets that bring things or add more to the world, and then malefics, things that take away, that remove, that basically like decrease, right? And the malefics are Mars and Saturn. And Mars is war and sex, love, pain, pleasure, beauty, the ugliness of war. All of that is all connected. And when we look at even those harder aspects of Mars, right, things like war and conflict, if we are not able to embody Mars and embrace Mars, we will be walked over for our entire lives. And so, even though Mars brings up a lot of pain and is a destructive force, if we do not destroy the things that do not serve us, what will ever come for us? And then I look at Saturn, known as the Greater Malefic, and I'm a Saturn defender. People love to fight about Saturn. And say Saturn is evil and there's nothing redeeming about Saturn, or Saturn is actually all good and great and everything that Saturn does is for a reason. And I definitely lean towards the everything Saturn does is for a reason. But one of the big lessons of Saturn is patience and growth through pain. Right. There's a old Latin quote, and I don't know the Latin for it, but it's through suffering to the stars. And what Saturn teaches us is that we are more resilient than we thought we were, and that in these painful moments, we can see that one, karma is real and will come for those who have hurt us, and two, that there is a meaning in the darkness out there somewhere. So, what you should do is when you are suffering, find your strength in that. I do not think it is right to idolize weakness, right? This is an Abrahamic thing. Nietzsche wrote this interesting idea called the the slave and master morality. He wrote this a lot in his book Beyond Good and Evil, which is a very heretical, edgy book. But one critique he threw at Christianity is that Christianity's focus around Jesus as someone who was strong in his weakness is venerating the weak. And this is somewhat true. And it's something we should keep in mind because, unlike Nietzsche, I do think there is power in suffering. I think there's a lot of meaning to be found in suffering, but I think we need to understand that the beauty of suffering is that the suffering teaches us what our will is and where our will comes from, not the suffering itself. We like suffering for what it teaches us because most people will not learn these lessons any other way than suffering. Often, like, people are kind of learned by the trial of fire creatures. And so that's my thought on suffering. Suffering is good, but only if it's suffering for a purpose. I do not believe we should be engaging in like spiritual masochism, right? Where we like purposely seek out suffering all the time and like languish in it and like sort of esotericize like a victim mindset. I completely disagree with that. But I think when we are suffering, which is inevitable, we should find purpose in it and understand that things do happen for a reason, right? Couples break up specifically so someone can find a better love or because someone was unhappy, right? Those are hard experiences, but they are often for our best interest. And so I think when we suffer, we should try to see why we are suffering because, once again, nothing happens for a reason, and then understand what is coming from that suffering and how to make the most of that suffering to become a stronger person in the end. Now, the next concept I want to talk about in this conversation is what is known as the dark night of the soul. So, this term, I think most people are familiar with it in the writings of Joseph Campbell, who wrote a lot about art and literature, but also was very metaphysical in his work. And his stuff inspired a lot of fiction writing, but it also inspired a lot of occultism. And the dark night of the soul, as a vague idea, pretty much exists in every religion, right? In Christianity, Jesus went to the desert for all those days and like fasted. In older religions, you saw like coming of age ceremonies. In modern occultism, people would cross the abyss. Like crossing the abyss is something that comes up a lot in modern Western occultism. All of these things, right, kind of revolve around the idea that there's a period of your life where you have to withdraw, understand yourself, and this period is very arduous and hard, but it leads to something good. Um, and the phrasing pretty much sums it up. Our soul goes through a dark night where we are tested greatly, and we are able to learn and understand ourselves. Metaphysical test as an idea is something that bothers a lot of people. They're like, well, I shouldn't be tested metaphysically. I should just be love and light all the time. But that's not how life works. Often, if we are not tested in this way, we will not grow in this way. A lot of people look at ancient mythology and find it really fucked up and are like, wow, these gods are horrible. These people, they went through so much. But the gods are doing things for a reason. They're not just like selfish pricks in the sky, right? They are testing us for a reason. And there's an entire category of ritual practice known as ordeals where people will intentionally seek out an experience that they know will include a level of suffering so that they can grow from that suffering and learn ideas like resilience and will from those direct experiences. So our dark night of the soul has a purpose, and the big thing that I have noticed in people's dark nights of the soul is that in those dark hours, they learn to understand themselves in a way that they never could any other way. If their lives had continued to be mundane and not have all these things happen, they would not have reached the potential that they're at now. And so when you experience a dark night of the soul, you should make sense of it, understand it, lean into it, and try to see what that dark night of the soul is actually teaching you. What is the lesson that you are meant to learn? And one part of the dark night of the soul that I think is important to bring up is the endless life, death, and rebirth cycle. So everything we do is cyclical, right? Specifically around the cycle of birth, life, growing older, dying, and then after death, becoming reborn. Life, death, rebirth, in that order. And these things, it sounds like it's a process you do one time, but instead I see it as like a wheel that keeps turning, right? Kind of like how the great wheel of the cosmos is known as samsara in Eastern religion. And it's this like wheel looking thing where you go through all these phases until you get it right. And then you break free from the cycle of samsara and unite fully with the gods, right? And now, I think we are basically slugging through samsara repeatedly when we go through hardships in our lives because we're reminded of this cycle of life, death, rebirth, and so on and so on. Um, and I think that that is, notable. I think that we go through these things for a reason. And one thing that I do want to bring up is it is very possible with things like the Dark Night of the Soul to have them multiple times, right? As I mentioned, a lot of people are getting pushed through this repeatedly. There is definitely a way in which you can have multiple Dark Nights of the Soul. Now, I want to connect that to a related topic, and that would be the topic of crossing the abyss. Unlike the Dark Night of the Soul, you cannot like repeatedly cross the abyss. Crossing the abyss is a much more specific thing. I think often people use Dark Night of the Soul and Crossing the Abyss, especially in like Thelema or medicine places, like really overlappingly, and they are not the same thing. Because Dark Nights of the Soul are also not really something caused by ritual. I mean, they can be inadvertently caused by ritual. Like, I think a lot of people who do rebirth rituals or initiations often experience a Dark Night of the Soul because there was something in their life that needed to go, right? Because with an initiation, a new life begins. With a rebirth ritual, obviously you're going through death and life and all that. But what happens in those cases is people do these rituals and then there's something that really needed to go, and the gods basically throw their hand and rip it from you and then send you into a dark night of the soul. Whereas crossing the abyss is a little bit different because it's much more specific, and this exact phrasing is very isolated to modern Western occultism. Now, there are similar ideas in other religions. A lot of initiatory frameworks have something similar to this, but the exact phrasing of crossing the abyss is much more specific and is not something that is done multiple times. It is a singular event, especially within a thelemic concept. It is very, very specific. So, crossing the abyss is based on Western occultism, and we have to look at the Kabbalistic tree of life to understand this idea, because the idea of crossing the abyss really does come from a Kabbalistic framework where you are beginning at Malkut and then working your ways up the spheres. There's this really important diagram, and I hope everyone listening to this looks it up right now, called the Lightning Flash Kabbalah, and I think that diagram will really explain what I'm talking about. But basically, what it is that you take the Kabbalistic tree of life, and then going down for it from the Ein Sofs, the layers of non existence, there's this like slash of lightning, and in that order, the spears come down from God and into existence. And you'll see if you look at the lightning flash diagram, most of them also have a snake coming up the other way. And the snake is the adept climbing up the tree through a series of initiations and mystic process, and you are that snake climbing that tree. And as that snake climbs that tree, you will go through all the spears, right? You'll go through the triads, but once you get right before those top three spears, known as the supernal triad, you will see there is this giant gap. Whereas every other like lower triad on the tree of life, there is a middle sephira. Right in that bit, there is no middle sephira, and this is Dot. Dot, the namesake of my YouTube channel, is the abyss in these metaphysical systems. And what you'll notice is, unlike the other ones, you can't climb through that spear of equilibrium middle thing. You have to actually cross that, because Dot is a spear, but also isn't a spear. I mean, you can argue it's a spear. It doesn't behave like any of the other spears, okay? For the sake of this conversation making sense, it is a non existent spear. Dot is there, but Dot is also not there. And to cross to those supernals, which gets you to the highest level of attainment, you got to cross this giant void. And to cross this giant void, you have to go through a very complicated initiatory process and go through a very extreme and specific version of the Dark Night of the Soul. The way that this is specific is, and I'm going to use the Thelemic explanation. So basically, there's the Thelema known as the Scarlet Woman, which is like someone who takes on the incarnation of Babylon or whatever. It's not literally like sexy girl. It's basically like a conduit to throw you into the abyss. So, from a male magician perspective, this is often described as like you find your Scarlet Woman, and then your Scarlet Woman throws you to the abyss, and then you have to cross the abyss, which, okay, toxic relationship vibes aside, I really critique Crowley for this explanation of this, because I think that this is a very specific way of experiencing this. I do not think all people are thrown to the abyss from like a bad romantic relationship. I think that's like really him projecting his own experiences on everyone. There's a lot to unpack there, but whatever. Basically, something will happen and you will be thrown into the abyss and you will have to cross the abyss. Now, many people, though, I will say, do specific rituals, especially one known as the Oath of the Abyss, and specific degree initiations that like inherently throw you into the abyss. And basically, Crowley explained that to cross the abyss, you had to cross into the first spear you would reach would be Binah, which is the feminine Saturn. But while you were crossing that abyss, essentially, he would said that it felt like you were fully disconnected from all divinity, right? And before you cross the abyss in Thelema, you have to go through this very long process of getting to know your holy guardian angel. And when you're in the abyss, your HGA is basically radio silent, right? You feel fully alone. But what you have to remember while crossing the abyss is that you are never fully alone. And one of the big revelations and realizations of crossing Dot and crossing the abyss is that even in this dark hour, the divinity is still right beside you. You just can't see it, but it's still there. Crowley believed if you went through this process and failed to cross the abyss, you would be basically like devoured by this evil spirit known as Karanzan, and honestly, game over. You're fucked. So the abyss is like a very extreme, specific version of this. And crossing the abyss is really only something that is discussed from a thelemic framework, but it does exist in other ideas in different forms. And the idea that I find so interesting from crossing the abyss is that in that moment when you are crossing the abyss, you feel alone. You almost feel like you're an atheist, but you realize that that's not true. And I think that's one of the most beautiful ideas ever is like, even in our darkest hour, right? Divinity is there. Even when we feel alone, even when we feel lost, there is still someone out there. There is still something out there. And the big realization most people have is that even though I couldn't, say, reach my holy guardian angel in the way I would want to, my holy guardian angel was forever protecting me. Now, people who have kind of failed this ritual tend to have very severe negative outcomes. And so I think that as a mystic, especially if you are not a new practitioner, and especially if you're not a Thelemite, there is no reason in seeking out a Thelemic version of crossing the abyss because you can get a lot of these attainment based effects through other means. Now, if you have a very Thelemic structure, then this might make sense, but I can't even give enough warnings with crossing the abyss. It is typically reserved for very, very experienced practitioners, whereas doing shadow work or regressing into past issues or dark nights of the soul can be done at kind of any experience level. Crossing the abyss is very advanced and very specific, and students in Thelema who have crossed the abyss are supposed to be obligated to have made knowledge and conversation with their holy guardian angel first. Now, is that always enforced? No. And in the age of the internet, people can Google Oath of the Abyss and like do it in 5 minutes and then their life fall apart, right? All those gatekeepers that made a culture more secret are completely gone. So, I just want to add a big caution here. If you do not feel immensely called and immensely ready and have a lot of experience, do not do crossing the abyss type rituals. Now, if you want to understand crossing the abyss more as like a thing that maybe you'll do in 20 years or you want to just think about, I really recommend the Vision and the Voice by Crowley and the Book of Lies. The Book of Lies is written as a guidebook for people who are currently crossing the abyss. It may not read like that if you don't know what you're looking at because it's very well veiled, but that's what that is. And so to understand all the emotions and things that go into crossing the abyss, Book of Lies is really great. It's very much like reading the Book of the Law, where it's like, what is happening, but I'm intrigued. Very much that. So one thing I wanted to talk about just briefly is how one of the most interesting things that I noticed when I was thinking deeply about these topics and exploring my own past experiences is the relationship between the Sun and Saturn, the polar opposite planets. So the Sun is, of course, charismatic, bold, kingly, and Saturn is cold, quiet, legalistic, karmic. And what's so interesting to me, though, is Sun and Saturn are very much two sides of the same coin. And what you'll learn when you do shadow work is the parts of your mind and soul that are the opposite of your shadow are still the other side of the coin. So be thinking about that. I really recommend if you want to do this type of work to look at your natal chart and look at your descendant sign. That will be whatever is opposite your ascendant or rising sign, because understanding your descendant sign and how that relates to you is going to be very, very helpful on these journeys as you go deeper and deeper into these subjects. So, one other thing I want to discuss, just a casual thing to bring up, the problem of evil. So, the problem of evil is a metaphysical debate that's been going on since really the beginning of religion. Is if why is God good? Why is there suffering? Why do we go through these things? Why do we face these things? Why would any just and fair God put us through this? What is the point? And I think the answer to that point is that, yeah, evil and suffering are real, but are they bad? Right? I think we have this idea, and it's ingrained from our culture, right? Any suffering is bad. We should try to be as comfortable as possible. We should never challenge ourselves. We should always be in our comfort zone. And as long as we are in our comfort zone, how are we ever going to make sense of things? And so I think the answer to the problem of evil is the gods and bad things can coexist because within the good there is bad. The gods themselves, and this is also another reason why I'm not a Christian, do bad things, right? The gods themselves have difficult myths. And I love ancient myths for this reason because you see the negative sides of the virtues of the gods displayed, right? Ares is, of course, someone who defends his nation, represents protection and passion and parts of love, but also is destructive. And by seeing that good and evil are not dichotomous, but kind of go together, that mercy and severity come together, it is one easier to make sense of suffering, and questions like the problem of evil kind of disappear from our consciousness, and we can just focus on our spiritual growth. So, the very last thing I want to discuss, this is my final point, is if you've heard all this and you want to get started and you want to heal, look at what your spiritual practice is. Add some shadow work. Make sure you're not doing too much shadow work, though, and integrate some spirits who relate to these themes, right? Integrate whatever spirits from whatever pantheon you use, or if you're Christian, specific angels or whatever, to help you face these topics and make sense of them. Do actual ritual. Do not just write journals or make meditative prompts. Go on path working style journeys, invoke spirits, really explore what it is in your shadow that you need to work towards and work through, and actually get it done using material rituals, right? Do not just say you're going to do it, do not just talk about it, actually do rituals to work through it, because a ritual is incredibly powerful. Ritual is not a joke, ritual is serious. So make sure you are doing ritual if you want to work through these things. It is going to make such an important thing. And actually, I lied. One last point. This journey of shadow work, healing, understanding ourselves, knowing ourselves, that's never going to end. This is not something that you just like do once one afternoon, like one Tuesday, you like sit down and you're like, okay, I'm fixing myself. No, no, no. This is a continuous journey. As long as you live, you will be doing this stuff. And that's just something that you're going to need to integrate into your regular practice if you want to reach your goals. So that is all for this podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're on a podcasting platform, please leave a review. This podcast is supported through Patreon. You get a bonus pre-show mini episode before every single episode. You get a bonus episode 8 times a year. And you get my love and affection. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!